So I'll introduce Josh Healy. To go next. Thank you, Josh.
Well, thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I want to begin by echoing the acknowledgement that others have made of the Awabakal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. This is a paper that is very much still under development. As these things sometimes go, I suppose I'd hoped that it might have developed a bit further by this point in time, but it's still very much a work in progress. To those that have heard earlier versions of this presentation, sorry, trust you've forgotten that by now anyway, and we're continuing to work on these ideas. The focus of this paper is on the gig economy, and before I dive into that, I suppose I just want to point out, for the interests of the group and our kind of collective discussion, that this does intersect and converge a bit with some of the things that we've already heard about this morning. So Ben was talking about, in particular, the ways in which young people might sort of normalise their experience of precarity and become very accustomed to that rather than organising against that or resisting that. And I think that's sort of a theme that comes through in this piece of work as well. And then also the discussion that we had following Rachel's presentation about public perceptions and I guess the importance of general community views. Steve mentioned about like social license, and I guess that sort of also plays into some of our thinking here as we're developing this work about the state of play within the gig economy. So that's the focus of this. What we're looking at is essentially attitudes that in particular young Australians have about the phenomenon of gig work. So we're not focused just on the creative space or the artistic industries, taking a more general view, but still, I think, playing thematically to some of what we've touched on already. Okay, so I guess just setting this in a wider context, like we know, it's not a surprise to anybody in this group, there's a lot of problems in the labour market for young adults today. And I suppose we're setting this up particularly thinking of the gig economy and gig work as being emblematic of some of these problems, synonymous with some of those wider problems, including the very embedded issue of precarity and how people are managing around that. We know already from other work, not our own, that young adults are very much represented in the gig economy sector as workers. And what differentiates this paper and the perspective we're taking is that we're thinking about their views of gig work as consumers. Okay, so we're not, our study is not of people that are working in the gig economy, but it's rather of people that are participating in this, buying the services, and essentially asking them what do they think about the nature of work that's going on. Are they generally in supportive of it? Are they critical of it? And focusing specifically on young people's views of that phenomenon. So just very quickly to give you a sense of what we're focusing on, there's obviously a very wide debate and discourse around platforms and gig work. You know, we're seeing ever more varieties of this kind of work emerging seemingly by the day. Where our specific focus in this work is on the kind of gig work that's done in person and that happens at a local level, right? So we're not talking about like Mechanical Turk, stuff that can be done from anywhere in the world, although that is part of the wider story. We're looking at essentially these varieties, right, which are familiar to all of us by now: ride-hailing, food delivery, buying in household-based tasks, and also care work as a new sort of form of this. There is likely to be others, as I've said, but that's the kind of specific focus that we're taking here. I guess we already know a fair bit about the nature of work in that context, right? So here's the obligatory still from Sorry We Missed You that kind of goes with this story that, you know, gave a very compelling kind of account of what that can look like for a family that's facing these kinds of working conditions. But just very quickly, you know, the context being people working as independent contractors, meaning they're kind of effectively carved out of the legal protections that are associated with traditional employment. uneven work schedules that are, of course, sold as being about flexibility for workers, but that are really about responsiveness to consumer demand, right? So I'm hammering on the consumer thing because that's the perspective we're trying to take in this paper. So that very much shapes the working conditions and the nature of the work. Okay, it's not just about discretion and autonomy for the workers. It's very much about what consumers need and where they need it to happen and when. As Ben already said, this is a situation where typically workers have to own and operate some of the capital, right? Whether it's just a phone or a bike or in some cases a car. The pay is usually by piece rate rather than hourly remuneration. And there's this whole debate now going on around algorithmic management and what that means, right? For disciplining of performance, for the possibilities of resistance and organisation, for deactivation and so on. So we're basically asking for consumers, what do they think? This is a critical view of the nature of the work, but what of that, I guess, cuts through for consumers when they're making decisions about whether to engage with this kind of work. So that's where we're coming in. We know already, as I said, there's a big literature basically, scrutinising gig work conditions and asking how these labour practices might, if not be totally eradicated, then somehow improved. And much of that focuses on either worker organising, like traditional forms of unions or new grassroots union movements that might organise against these conditions, or some kind of legal recourse, regulatory intervention. And that's great as far as it goes, but I suppose part of our argument is this neglects other actors and possible avenues for improving gig work, including the role of consumers. So in the gig work literature at the moment, there's a fair bit of thinking around this idea of triangular arrangements, in which the conditions that materialise are sort of thought to be created and contested between the platform companies, the people doing the work, and consumers, right? And that consumer piece has had comparatively little attention. So that's what we're trying to bring with this paper, and this sits within the wider context of other work we've done. I've done a fair bit of stuff with Andi Pekarek and with Ariadne Vroman, who are both contributors to this paper as well. Okay, so why study young adults in this context? Well, I guess we're setting this up as a bit of a, it could be a bit of this and it could be a bit of that. We won't pretend to have resolved all these inherent sort of uncertainties about what's going on, but we could say that, as a starting point, on the one hand, right, on the left-hand side, we know young adults face a difficult job market and they know it. Okay, I'll show you in a moment some evidence of that. They make up a large segment of gig workers, and so possibly, we might see evidence of a kind of intragenerational solidarity, right, that might lead them to being more negative or more critical in their views of gig work. Okay, one possibility. On the other hand, they're heavier users of platforms. Again, I'll show you evidence of that, and that use tends to be more positively associated with views. And so there might be, and this is not, of course, just for young people, a degree of willful ignorance playing itself out here that means that they sort of know it's bad, but they want to continue using it anyway, that might then generate more positive views. Okay, so how are we going about trying to disentangle some of this? We're using data that we're involved in collecting through the Australian Cooperative Elections Survey. Every 3 years or so when there's a federal election, this survey happens. It's done of eligible voters. It's done as an online mode of participation. And basically what we and a bunch of our collaborators did was to chip in a bit of money to buy some additional questions that basically piggyback onto that main survey. Okay, and that module that we developed is focused on work and includes some questions about work in the gig economy. So mainly we're looking at a sample of just over 1,000 people, okay, that come from a wider group that respond to these questions that are largely about like voting intentions and political attitudes. And then we add on this additional bit, which is focused on work. It's quite a rich data set, and I guess we're just very much using a slice of it here to try to motivate this paper. Okay, so just diving into the results, and trying to think through this a bit and set it up. First of all, so a few propositions, right, that I want to try and support with evidence from this survey. The first thing is that young adults definitely do see the labour market differently. Okay, so what this does, we ask everybody who responds to our module a series of questions about the extent to which they think these different things are problematic in Australian workplaces today. And all this slide does is to make a distinction between the younger respondents and I guess the non-young or older group, right? And you can see here a bunch of questions where there's a statistically significant difference, right, between the younger and older respondents' views. Okay, so without reading all this off, you know, young people are definitely more likely to agree with the proposition that wages aren't keeping up with the cost of living, and that's a problem. Balancing work and life, access to decent, good quality, flexible work. The only thing that they're significantly different on in a negative way is they don't care so much about work opportunities for older people. Okay, that goes the other way. Okay, still a significant difference. On everything else, they're higher, right? So they're saying, they're responding to this in a way that suggests that they're attuned, right, to the problematic nature of the labour market. And try to remember that in a few slides' time when I show you the results focusing on gig work. Okay, so they do see the labour market differently. That's the first thing. The second proposition is that they do use these digital labour platforms more, okay? In fact, quite a bit more when it comes to the most prevalent varieties, okay? So just looking at like the takeaway delivery, you know, option, and also looking at the Uber type ride hailing sector, the frequency of use, both occasionally and more regularly, meaning, you know, more than once a month, are a fair bit higher there, okay, for younger people than they are for the older population. Okay, so they're making use of these platforms. They're very much kind of participating in them on the user side. Okay, so and I guess what we're then interested in thinking about is how does that influence their views, which is the next bit, right? So interestingly, they don't seem to be noticeably more likely than others to sort of denigrate or denounce gig work, right? So there is just one, right, significant difference here, which is that compared with older respondents, they're more likely to agree that this kind of work leaves workers vulnerable and open to exploitation. Okay, so they are higher on that result. But on everything else, you can see there's no other numbers coloured in red there, and I'm using that to signify significant differences. They sort of look more or less like older people in their views about the nature of gig work, right? So we're asking them, would you say that this does these things, right? Allows people to have flexible work. You know, they largely agree with that, and so do older people as well, that they're a good option for people that can't get a regular job. Yeah, so I guess we're not seeing in that dramatic younger versus older differences. And when we try to just put that into a bit of a model, and this is really just a very preliminary attempt to do this, I'll generously to myself and my co-authors say this is a parsimonious model, okay? It needs to have a lot more probably done to it to make it a bit more realistic. But basically what we're asking here is, you know, how does age and platform use correlate with views, right? And basically what you see is that those with the least positive overall views are younger people who don't use platforms, okay? Believe it or not, there are some. They're not using platforms. That group provides our sort of base, our reference. And then you can see that more positive, but not a lot more in a statistical sense, older people that are also non-platform users. And then platform users, either younger or older members of that group, tend to be more positive. But you can see on the right-hand side that the differences between those four groups that are shown here aren't in and of themselves statistically significant in our data. they kind of look like the patterns you would expect, but they're not sort of jumping out at us in a statistical sense, right? So we think we aren't there yet. We want to kind of keep working on this stuff. As I said, this is sort of at a preliminary stage. Just by way of some initial reflections, we're going to keep digging in the data. The interesting thing that I guess comes from this is that those misgivings about the wider job market don't seem to mar young people's views of gig work. Okay, so it's as though they're able to sort of separate that, and we don't see the negativity that influences their general views of the job market necessarily transferring across to the same extent in their views of the gig economy. That's interesting. They're obviously kind of reproducing some of those wider perceived pros and cons about the nature of this work and being a bit higher on that element where they're critical of the vulnerability of the workforce and the potential for exploitation. But it doesn't look like just being young per se is determinant of their views in that respect. So we want to go into this. The data set does include, as I said, more information about political attitudes and the kinds of ways in which people participate in work and in the community more generally, that we'll have a look at whether they play a role as well in explaining what's going on. Much like the wider population, there's this kind of question, right, about whether convenience confounds resistance. Okay, again, picking up on a point that Ben made earlier on, this idea of what we've normalised and the obvious kind of convenience of these services sort of challenging what we might otherwise anticipate in terms of negativity of views and willingness to resist. So we've got more to do, but I'll leave it there in the interest of time, and thanks for listening and any questions. Cheers.